etc. But I felt that didn't give me the kind of room I wanted to really tell the stories that I wanted to tell. So then I thought creative nonfiction was an avenue which bridged both the idea of empathy and the idea of truth, or somebody's own personal truth together. So that's how the idea of creative nonfiction came about. And then I thought, you know, what stories do I want to put out there? And initially I wanted it to be an anthology of very diverse voices from Pakistan, people whose voices weren't being heard in the mainstream. Eventually it became, you know, a mix of both. Also, there were logistical concerns, timelines, etc. So we couldn't, you know, include everyone that we wanted to. But I think we managed to get a good mix of, you know, older voices who were reflecting on nostalgia, almost a comparative journey of the country with their own sense of identity and belonging. We had new voices who were talking, who were looking forward, you know, anticipating the future. What is it like to be the newer generation of Pakistan? We have expat voices who are reflecting on what it means to just carry Pakistan inside you, you know, to not have those boundaries of geography contain what it means to be Pakistani. So yeah, that's generally how the idea came about. And then, you know, as the share goes, kafla chalta gaya, saath log aate gaye.
Yes.
I'm butchering it, but yeah, so that's how,
Yeah, absolutely. Sabine, I'm going to say maybe we ask you to read a little bit from the introduction, so people, I know, will want to get the book later, but it'll just give a flavor of kind of where your headspace was at the time. So if you don't mind.
Yes, definitely. I'll do that. So I'll read from the introduction.
Yeah.
But, I just realized I need glasses too. Actually, I didn't just realize it, but I'm very resistant to it. Okay, so sorry. Okay, I'll just read a little bit from the beginning. This is the introduction of Ways of Being. This is the book. It's very elusive, so get your copy before it sells out. Okay. When the idea of putting together an anthology of Pakistani women writers' creative nonfiction was put to me by the feminist publisher Ritu Menon, I hesitated. The first question that ran through my mind was, but who is a Pakistani writer? Who has the right to call herself a Pakistani writer? Someone who lives in the country, or someone who carries the country within her? Upon a quick search, I found that I was not the only one deliberating this point. The question of who a Pakistani writer is has dominated many a discussion in recent debates on global Anglophone literature, but it has raised more questions than answers. I found myself wondering who, in this age of mass displacement, when very few of us have the luxury to be rooted in one place, can claim to belong solely and wholly anywhere at all. To complicate matters, the rise of the internet has shrunk traditional borders, making the question of identity even more fraught. Economic migration, religious persecution, emerging right-wing nationalism, populism, pandemics, lockdowns have forced many of us to reckon with a new plurality of identities, where the boundaries of nationality or a singular cultural identity are no longer relevant in the context of our dynamic times. It is instead the question of voice that matters. I found myself thinking, who you are is no longer a question of where you are from. Rather, who you are is more accurately represented by what you stand for. A Pakistani writer, therefore, for the purposes of this anthology, is one who feels a connection to the land, either by origin or by sensibility. I'll just read a little bit more
Please,
about
yeah, please.
the idea of why non-fiction. Okay, and also why the language that we are writing in. Okay. While social media, blogs, online forums, and feminist consciousness may have given Pakistani women the room nowadays that Virginia Woolf deems necessary for a woman to write, what holds them back is the pressure regarding what they can or cannot write. In that sense, the burden of representation and the fear of a backlash often curtails the narrative. I'm talking about fiction. I'm reminded of Rachel Cusk's response to Woolf's essay, Shakespeare's Sister, in 2007, where she writes, "The woman writer who confines herself to her female reality is by the same token often criticized. She appears to have squandered her room, her money. It is as though she has been swindled or swindled herself. She is the victim of her own exploitation." The new generation of Pakistani women faces the same double bind of gender and creativity that predecessors like Fahmida Riaz or Khalda Hussain faced when they wielded their fiery pens in the face of dictators and societal patriarchs, or their literary ancestors before them, such as Kurtalain Haider or Khatija Mastoor, who wrote about the trauma of partition. Except this time, it is not a dictator or a cleric, but the global reader imposing the burden of representation on them. It is with this in mind and the courage it takes up to pick up the pen and tell the truth that this anthology of Pakistani women writers deserves a space of its own. Autobiographical non-fiction strips the writer of any protection that fiction may offer her. There are no characters to mouth the dialogues, no plot disclaimers to say that all the events in this story are figments of the imagination. It takes courage to say, "This is what I believe in. This is what I really think. Here is what I stand for." The personal essay, therefore, demands ownership and accountability. And the writers in this anthology own their stories with courage and grace. So I'll stop there.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Sabyn.
Thank you to the writers who contributed.
No, and it's interesting because I had those exact lines on one of my questions, so we'll come back to that later. It's such a powerful part of the introduction. I want to talk a little bit, Sabyn, as a lot of you would know, Sabyn's also the writer of 2 novels. So Hijabistan is a collection of short stories, and she's also the writer of a novel called Nobody Killed Her. So I'm curious to ask you, Sabyn, how is curating an anthology? And like we said at the beginning, it's a process, it evolves, it morphs, you have an idea at the start and, it culminates eventually into something. Talk to us a little bit, because you've seen both ends, on the spectrum. Talk to us a little bit about how curating an anthology is different, and also how this kind of moved along over time, how you handpicked the writers. I know it's never like, the wish list is never complete. And I know that in the introduction, you said something really powerful about deliberating between kind of staying on the sidelines as a curator and an editor, or jumping in and standing in solidarity by contributing a piece. And eventually you did the latter. So talk to us about the journey with Ways of Being.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, Saba. So I think with a novel, with short stories, it's your own story. You're much more in control. The biggest difference, I feel, with the anthology is the number of moving parts. Curating a collection, reaching out to people, doing the hustle, the chasing, negotiating with publishers, and also enabling others to really find their voice.
Yeah.
I think as a writer, I realized when you're putting together an anthology, um, it is a collective effort. It is very much a kafla. It's a caravan. It's not your own personal journey. You're walking with a lot of people. You have to make sure everybody is, you're taking everyone along. No one is left behind. So that was the biggest difference. But I think also when you write a novel, you have a theme in mind, you have a plot in mind. I think if I had done an anthology which had like a specific theme, um, like there have been anthologies about cooking, desi cooking that was out. There was an anthology that Claire Chambers did about love and desire. If it's thematic, then I suppose it's much more easier in that sense. But I didn't want to set a theme. I really wanted people to decide, what do I want to write about? What is it that I want to say? What is it that I'm not getting a platform to talk about? Or, what is it that I want to share? I wanted it to be their own choice. So empowering the wonderful cohort of female writers along with me, encouraging them to choose, decide themselves. And quite a few of the writers were like, well, have a theme. This is just too, it's too loose. And I was like, no, why do we have to have these set ideas? Okay, this is what an anthology should be like. And also, I think I had some great examples in front of me. So my first publication was actually in Maniza Shamsi's anthology. I forget what it was called, even though I had the title story. And the world changed, yes, and the world changed. Where Manisa also, gave us that leeway, that space to contribute the stories that we wanted to. That was fiction. So I had a sort of a model in front of me. But yes, in nonfiction, usually it's more thematic. But I consciously made this decision to really, let people choose what is it that they want to bring to this conversation. And about contributing my own essay, again, I wanted it to be like a conversation, and I thought, should I stay out of the conversation? At a certain point, I started feeling like a voyeur. I felt I was a spectator and I was just observing a conversation, but I wasn't entering it. And at that point, I felt, no, I also have to jump in, and I also need to, contribute to this very interesting conversation that's going on. Because having said that I wanted people to take ownership, decide what they want to write, I also began to realize that the theme was emerging on its own.
Yeah.
A lot of us were talking about identity, about belonging, about our ties with the community. Your own essay, talks about, parental ties of, sort of loosening those ties and tightening those ties. And I felt that was a theme that was organically coming across.
Yeah. And I think that's a great segue, Sabyn, into talking a little bit. I know you touched upon this in the beginning, but just the range that we have in this anthology thematically. You've said that the themes within the collection are varied, but they're distinct yet analogous, which is such a powerful way to put it. And you've also said that they shatter the stereotype of the submissive Pakistani woman and speak for a cross-section of society, across generations and across the globe, which was a really, really great way of putting it, I thought. So talk to us, without any spoilers, talk to us a little bit about the versatility thematically that we have within the essays, but also of the title. So it's called Ways of Being, which I think it's got so much inherent openness in that title. Like there are an infinite ways of that you could be, basically. And yet we rarely associate those ways with Pakistani women. We like to stuff them in these cookie cutter molds, and you've almost stripped that open. And I love what you've said about keeping it fluid and almost letting that very organically emerge, which it has. So offer us a glimpse into the world and also talk a little bit about the title.
Definitely. Thank you for bringing that up. I think you yourself, have lived abroad, and that often there is a stereotype of people from certain parts of the world, of a certain background, certain race, and I mean, a lot has been said about, this whole idea of being homogenized because of your background. But I felt the conversation was very focused on how not to be, how people should not think. But there wasn't a lot of representation to show people that this is why you shouldn't think this way. I felt like there was a lot of articles, research coming out. Oh, this is not what Pakistani women are like. Oh, this is a cross section of Pakistani. Oh, there's intersectionality. There's class divide. But for me, I don't know. Maybe it's my background in fiction, but I was like, show, not tell. Like where is the representation? Where is the diversity of Pakistani women's writing, of their, how can we showcase that diversity instead of telling people how not to think? How can we say, this is also a way of being, instead of just focusing on, not the way to be.
Yes.
And the title very much is, has to do with, I mean, it takes from, John Burgess' ways of seeing. And I could see that there was a way of seeing. A way of seeing did exist, but the way of being was not being given space to exist. So that's why Ways of Being. Initially, it was titled Encounters, but then we had a discussion, and I have a 12-year-old who's a wonderful artist. She has a
just unbelievable
painting here, and she was like, this is, it's there's a lot of variety of how people are being in this, how people live their lives. And so it kind of like, spiraled, and we thought, instead of encounters, why not ways of being? So that's how it came
and I
about.
love that. I mean, for those of you who get the book later, please make sure you spend time on it. But I was shocked. I saw you post about it, and that's when I realized it was your daughter.
It's all my talent. being passed on.
Of course, that you're passing on. Sabyn, talk a little bit about language, because a lot of the contributors in this anthology are bilingual, or let's say they look at the world in a bilingual way or a multilingual way. What does that add to the lens into the conversation?
Yeah, so again, those colonial linguistic legacies still exist. Many of us, speak English almost as a first language, even though it's not our mother tongue. For many of us, it's a step-mother tongue, because, we learn it in later on. But it's very much a part of, if you have a certain educational background, if you have a certain class privilege. I know a lot of people consider it taboo to talk about it, but it is, it does extend us a certain privilege, and because of that, there is fluidity of the English language. And one of the things that I always used to find interesting would be working abroad, or I used to work at Habib, and we'd have a lot of faculty, global faculty, and this would always be the surprise, like, oh, but you all speak English very fluently.
Yes.
And then you would have to sit and explain the whole colonial legacy, the British Raj, the rule, and everything. And I also wanted to touch upon that actually there is a large tradition, a rich tradition of Anglophone writing, women's writing in South Asia, in Pakistan. There's a lot of work that has been done on that. And it's not that there is a tradition, just that there's a tradition of women's writing in Pakistan, but there's a separate, distinct tradition of Anglophone women's writing along with the vernacular writing. Just like there's a tradition of Urdu women's writing, just like there's a tradition of Sindhi women's writing, just like there's a tradition of Punjabi women's writing, Saraiki poetry, women's poetry. So I wanted to consciously make a point that this is not just certain people who are fluid in English writing, but it falls within a tradition, a canon of Anglophone writing coming
Sure.
from a certain part of the world.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers your
Absolutely
question.
does. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I wanted to, take it up from there and say that using the anthology as a springboard, we talk about access all the time, and we talk about the fact that, you've spoken about the burden of representation, you've spoken about, potential backlash, and a lot of us as female writers self-censor as well because of that, right? How does one widen the conversation, Sabine? How does, and I suppose I also want to bring in technology here, which is a double-edged sword in many ways. But a lot of women will not have access to start with, and access means so many different things. Where does one go? Like, how does one think about this conversation?
Yeah, Saba, I think that's a very difficult question to answer because I think there was certain idealization when and certain optimism when I put this together. The whole idea of access, I thought that we would be able to make this available through certain platforms. It would be available at a very low cost, and I thought it would encourage us to, put together more such anthologies, have more projects like this. But unfortunately, I think I was quite optimistic about that. Some of the writers were really passionate about addressing issues which weren't being spoken about commonly. I thought that this anthology would give them that access. Eventually, we did manage to do that, but eventually there were repercussions. And that led me to believe that this whole idea of women self-censoring, which I write about in my introduction, that, yes, we come from times where there were dictators. Yes, we come from a time where, amazing pioneers like Sabyn Mahmood were silenced because of, assault, violence, murders. We have those amazing examples. But unfortunately, this has led to a lot of self-censorship because when you try to break out, as I'm seeing now, it's not something that you can do in isolation. It's not something you can do because I think that change again has to be grassroots. It has to come. It has to be a cultural change. But I'm really hoping that more initiatives like this, maybe having more workshops for women to, have voices, to be able to express themselves. There'll be more avenues, more opportunities. Social media, as you said, is one such room that provides it. But again, there's also a huge backlash, as we have seen. So I think actually your question about access, about self-censorship, it's a really important one, but I really don't know what to say anymore because I feel, I really feel that I tried, and I have to sadly say that I was being very optimistic.
Yeah.
But I really hope that, we find support and projects like these can go on.
Yeah, yeah. No, thanks for that honesty. I completely agree with you. Sabine, I want to sort of, before we open it up to the audience Q&A, I want to talk to you about, somewhere in the introduction, you've said that the idea of separating writers by gender didn't appeal to you, to start off with at least. And exactly like you said, there is yet a tradition of women's writing within Pakistani Anglophone literature that merits a place of its own. Talk to us about why it was important to keep this an all-women's anthology. And Sabine puts it really powerfully. She says, there's different point of view, minority outlook, underdog history is important to listen to. So talk to us a little bit about how you thought that through and finally said, this is going to be an all-women's anthology.
Yeah, again, the excellent point that you brought up, Saba. So I don't know about you, Saba, but when I wrote Hijabistan, I had quite a few reviews where I was being told, what I should have written, and I have found that fascinating that, my craft wasn't being critiqued, my style or, the stories, characterization. It was like, oh, no, but this story should have ended this way. One of the stories I had written was about sexual harassment in the workplace, and the reviewer had written, "Oh, but in the story, the protagonist should have stood up to the boss, and that's how it would have been a feminist story then. Like you shouldn't." And I was like, "What?" So that made me. And when I was curating this anthology, initially, I thought, why do we need to do this? Why does it have to be Pakistani women's? Why can't it just be Pakistani non-fiction? And as I was scouting the essays, I realized that there is a tradition of women's writing, which, they were writers telling parallel stories of the history of Pakistan, and then I was getting contributions which were not by women, which were very, there was a difference in themes. And I felt that, by curating women's voices, I was providing a larger platform for an alternative or parallel history of, not just the journey of the state, but the individual's journey to identity and belonging and self-actualization. So that was a conscious decision to do so. And then within those women also, I wanted to have a cross-section of those who are rooted in Pakistan, those who live abroad, those who are of the younger generation, those who are of the older generation. So I felt, that those were the stories which needed a platform at this point. But yes, most of the need I felt came from this personal experience of being told what to write, not how to write.
And I so appreciate that, Sabyn, because as you know, even in my own essay in the anthology, obviously it was a difficult, tender topic to write about. And I think the fact that there was so much leeway in a sense, and this is what you were saying earlier, but also the fact that for me, the piece that I've written, I really feel it's an example of the personal being political.
Should read.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to read a bit from it, but I just felt there was something about the anthology that, if you recall, I gave you a couple of other options earlier, and then without telling Sabyn, I took a punt and said, I'm just going to write this piece and maybe she'll take it. But yeah, I'll read a little bit from it, Sabyn, and then we'll open up for questions.
I remember when Saba gave me the first essay. I had reached out to Saba and I really wanted her to contribute, and she sent me an essay which said all the right things. But I felt that I wanted to hear her voice. I wanted to hear what she felt, not what she thought or she should be. And I felt that there was that room for that conversation, that connection. And then the essay that came out was just beautiful.
Thank you. So this is an essay that is really a tribute to my late father and to my mother, whose value I think I appreciated much more in retrospect. I mention Abu everywhere, I mention her a lot less, so I think this is really a dual tribute, and I'll read a little bit from a couple of different parts. It's called Two Roads Diverged in a Wood and I, which were really lines from Robert Frost's poem, which were one of my father's favorite verses. On the 16th day of September, on a cloudless, clement Karachi morning, without any warning, my father threw a monkey wrench into our lives and died. He was sitting on a restful, cottony sofa, they later told us, getting ready to deliver a presentation he had been preparing all week to inspire a crowd of high school students about Ghalib and the Bard, urging them to try and be cultural omnivores, when he simply fell asleep. When the headmistress stepped out of her office to cue him to the hall, she was discomfited to think he had sloped into slumber while waiting, but hastily attributed it to the weariness of Ramzan, trying to avoid mutual embarrassment. Minutes later, when we received the first phone call, they offered us a half-truth, perhaps to keep a flicker of hope alive. My brother, then at work, raced home in a rickshaw, and together we dashed to the hospital, searching frantically for its location in a pre-Google Maps era. Every inch of the journey, as I recall it, a jumble of anticipation and dread of when the phone might ring, hammering out an ultimate verdict. That evening, friends and relatives gathered to offer condolences, and their doggedness about my father's good fortune in leaving the world so effortlessly was almost infectious. The best way to go, admittedly an enviable end, Jannati to be taken so naturally. People condoled as we said our final goodbyes to Abu and laid him to rest. That same morning at the hospital, when a staff member in a pristine, starchy lab coat clinically handed us our father's spectacles and car keys, directing us to sign forms and finalize formalities, the whole scenario had seemed surreal, a lot less enviable than mourners subsequently made it out to be. Some months had to pass before I realized that they were simply trying to help. If you think about it, there's never a good time to lose a parent. But when it happens in ways so startling, the grief appears amplified by shock. That's precisely how it was with me, rendering my human capability of reacting and grieving extinct. Well, at least in ways that grief manuals expect you to mourn the loss of a loved one, with proof in a handbasket, visible, hysterical, entirely inconsolable. For days, I would lock myself in the bathroom and besiege divinity, the same one that I clung to so tightly for a release to my anguish, to let me howl and whimper, but its time had not yet arrived. I would feel the tears brimming, but they lay there like stubborn corpses, a strange dignity about them as they shone unspilled. My father's loss was literal, but what loomed even larger and more abstract was the expiry of an exalted ideal, a dream. And I'm just going to skip quickly to another part. It stayed that way for a while, and it wasn't until a decade later, as grief morphed into precious recollection, that I stumbled upon the hint of a creative renaissance, one that seemed to grant me permission to reimagine all that my father had coaxed us to dream about, of becoming and of possibilities taking on potential. One winter morning, I was sitting in a class in Abu Dhabi, where I now live and work, listening to a guest speaker, the headmaster of a school in England, tutoring undergraduate students about the importance of mindfulness, of being immersed in the moment, when the occasion for the said renaissance erupted. He quoted a rehashed version of Henry David Thoreau's words. Most men and women lead lives of quiet desperation and go to the grave with the song still in them, he narrated mellifluously. I clung to his words, soaking in the magnitude of what was being laid before us. What's your song? He seduced us of prospects that might take flight if we discovered our song. Take 5 minutes and scribble your song on a piece of paper and share it with the person sitting next to you. Of course, it was unnerving, scribbling something so consequential in a blithe, time-bound fashion. Still, I took aim and scribbled hard, for the headmaster's words had forced me to reckon with what I had been procrastinating over ever since I lost my father. Storytelling, I recall writing on a scrap of paper. Storytelling is my song. Eventually, toying with this complex web of experience, emotion, and expression, so close to the bone as this, requires me to reassemble fragments from my past, tether them to the present, and carry them into the future. Perhaps the best gift it offers in its wake is that it propels me to fulfill, in ways tiny and large, the dream my father carried, so that someday I may be able to say, 2 roads diverged in a wood and I took the road less traveled by. It has made all the difference.
Saba, that was beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I really appreciate it. And I think these are the beautiful moments that very often when we are curating these big thematic anthologies, we don't get a chance to share those personal moments of, what makes us us. And what you read out is so personal. It's your journey, it's your grief, but it's so common to so many of us. So many of us have faced grief. So many of us have found what is it that we want to do with the rest of our lives by through the loss of someone that we love dearly. So, you sharing that with us in this anthology, I think that's, very grateful. Thank you for that.
And I appreciate that so much, Sabyn, because as I was saying earlier, I think it's taken me a really long time to process and think about it, let alone writing about it. And there was something about the way you put this anthology together that really made me come to it after a few tryouts of other sorts of things. Thank you for listening to that, and also we'll open up to questions now. So
can I just say, I realize how difficult it must have been for you to write this. So, and it makes me think about all the other contributors as well, how much courage it took to really go so deep down inside and write about what really matters to them. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sabyn. And I want to open up to the audience now. So, yes, we've got a lady in the third row.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I've got to say that this anthology is very timely. I think somehow Pakistani women writing is an idea whose time has come. I just a little bit to give you a bit of background. My name is Saira, and I founded the Zinat Harun Rashid Writing Prize for Women 4 years ago, and we have been dealing with fiction as well as non-fiction. And one of the points you raised, Sabyn, of who is a Pakistani writer, and questions of identity. But in terms of the anthology, are we also talking about, I mean, it's fine to be inclusive as you suggest, but should Pakistani writers or who we deal with, are you also making a distinction between diaspora writing and writers whose focus is on Pakistan? Because there is a lot of diaspora writing, people like Ayad Akhtar and whose books and things are not necessarily Pakistan focused. So I just wondered whether you were conscious of that distinction between diaspora writing and women writing in Pakistan, for Pakistan, about Pakistan. So I mean, I have one or two other points, but I'll let that sit with you.
Could we get the other mic to, is it possible to turn that on?
I'll just use this, yeah. Thank you so much, Saira, for your question and for the fabulous work that you yourself are doing. And I have to say that I actually turned to your prize to reach out to many of the writers in the anthology because I feel it has provided a platform for a lot of new voices or voices that weren't I wasn't familiar with. Your question about the distinction between diaspora writing and writers who are based in Pakistan or diaspora writing about Pakistan, I actually did away with all of that. Initially, when I was starting out, I was very conscious. I was thinking, I'm going to have this distinction between geographies, between imagination. And as I started reaching out to people, I realized, firstly, logistically, few of the writers who were based here, who I wanted to include, very sadly, they could not eventually, they were not comfortable because of safety reasons. So there were some restrictions and some limitations. And that led me to think that for the purposes of this anthology, what I'm looking at is Pakistaniyat. You know, whether you are based in Pakistan or whether you're carrying it within yourself as a diaspora. So yes, thematically, they are writing about the connection with Pakistan, but not necessarily from a nationalistic point of view, more from a personal point of view. Like Saba's essay, for example, it doesn't have anything to do with the physical element of geography, but it focuses on, you know, in many ways you're talking about the emergency services, you're talking about the lack of public transport, what happens when there's an emergency, how do you get to the hospital, what happens when you're mourning and people are telling you that actually this is, you know, a good thing. You know, those traditions which make us essentially Pakistani, you know, those little sentiments which we carry within us, whether we are living, you know, in Canada or Alaska or wherever. And another thing that I focus on in the introduction is that, you know, this is an age of mass displacement, not just outside the borders of Pakistan, but within Pakistan as well. You know, there is so much, despite lack of social mobility, there is a lot of transitioning happening right now. So yes, so basically focusing on the insaniyat of being Pakistaniyat. Okay, if that makes sense at all. So probably doesn't quite answer your question, but loosely around that.
Do we have, yes, Junaid.
Saying, I think I'm so is that does the song should keep changing throughout life, or is that one static song that?
Is there a chart buster?
I know. I think I'm still figuring that out, but I definitely feel it can keep changing, right? I mean, I'm someone who worked at Citibank, and you know now we're both at NYU, and so obviously I feel as you move along and evolve, and also I feel like you don't need to be limited to a single song, right?
Yeah.
So it should be something that gives you wings rather than actually constrains you or pulls you down. So the short answer would be multiple songs. Bilkul, chartbusters.
I'll just read out the
Yes,
home part.
please,
Yeah.
please, please.
Sorry, is there?
Yes.
So while we wait for more questions, I'll read something out as well. So when I decided to join this conversation, as the various writers in this anthology wondered, amused on the sense of belonging, my essay is called, and this is to give you all time to think questions, especially those of you who have been bought specially. Okay. So it's called Confessions of a Serial Migrant, an essay in first paragraphs. And then I thought, since it's my anthology, I'm going to dictate whether it has to be a proper plot or whether I can just write in first paragraphs. There's no one to stop me. So I used it as a place to experiment. So this particular essay, it doesn't go anywhere. It only begins in first paragraphs. So one of the first paragraphs is, home is a feeling. I think of myself as a serial migrant with a whirlpool of maps under my carbon footprint. I collect homes in my memory, adding each new place to an album of sights, smells, textures, and climates. Each place blurring the idea of home even more. For my parents, home was an ancestral town they left behind in India after partition. For my children, home is a button on their Apple devices that they press to access their digital lives. My parents' generation talked about the idea of home with an infectious nostalgia. My children think of it as a transitory concept, a technical detail. They are at home with technology. They FaceTime friends across continents, bonding over video games as if they were in the same room. Physicality is a minor detail for them. Unlike my parents, who cherished the odd letter that passed through the stringent borders and reminisced about the watan ki mitti, the smell of home soil as they turned the aerogram over and over in their hands, my children don't find distances a matter of inconvenience, so long as they have a good Wi-Fi connection. I'm somewhere in between, neither at home in the past, like my parents, nor in the future, like my children. Suspended somewhere in the middle, trying to figure out what home means to someone whose identity has slowly eroded with each move. In this age of mass displacement, there are many like me who feel at home in a country in which they are temporary residents, but are like strangers in the land of their birth. It makes me wonder why we think of home as a static concept. Home, if anything, is a metaphor for familiarity, comfort, and acceptance. I'll just read one more section. Okay. So the last bit is home is a quest. Home is a journey, a search, a pursuit. But for what? For a memory to be mourned or a desire to be pursued? In this era of exile and immigration, when very few of us have the luxury of spending our lives in one place, where can serial migrants like myself house their fragmented selves? Each move, every migration splits us further like a jigsaw puzzle with 1,000 pieces. Our loyalties divided, our memories scattered. Today, I live and work in the Gulf, but the journey to be independent, financially and emotionally, has been long and hard. I was born in Pakistan, lived in Britain, US, UAE, not by choice, but by chance. Each country built me up a little and broke me down a bit more. Slightly chipped, a little more chiseled. After migration, motherhood, marriage, divorce, and self-actualization, I find myself thinking, is home the place where I learned to speak? Or is it the place that silenced me? Is it where I found myself or the place where I lost myself? The place that gave me roots or the one that gave me wings? I am a person who feels like a stranger at home and at home in a place that is strange to me. Is home then just a concept that is transient in this world of serial migration and technological evolutions as it is elusive? Perhaps home is just a search for the self. And for me, home is in my writing, a place where I don't need any visas to visit, no tickets, no plane fare, only an imagination. The blank page is where I truly feel at home. Home, then, is what we write it to be. Home is a story that we tell ourselves.
Sabyn, that's so poignant, and I also feel like you give so many of us that language, who have had this experience. And not just physical migration, but I think as Mohsin Hamid says, all of us are migrants through time. You could stay in the same place, and just thank you so much. That was absolutely beautiful and so poignant. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being part of it. And thank you to all the contributors. I think some
Yeah,
of them
I don't
are
know if
here.
we have any more questions before we wrap. I think we have a couple of questions. Yes.
Hello, thank you, Saba and Sabyn, for the readings, and I can't wait to read the anthology. This might be a little bit difficult question, but I'd like you to answer it. Maybe you can both answer it. But like Sabyn, you started saying introduction that it's hard to tell. You were hesitating. Like, what is Pakistani? Like, what? And so I'd like to hear now that the anthology is all together. What is the common thread between the essays that kind of surfaced from there about identity, if that's what it is? I understand it's not. I don't mean, like you said earlier, it has to be nationalistic. But what does it mean to all these writers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Do you want to have a go? Or?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I'd be very interested to hear what you think also.
Yeah.
So I think now that it's out and the different essays, so if I could just quickly There are essays in here. One of the essays here writes, it's called, what the- where is it? Yeah, so one of the essays here by Hanana Zahir is called Writing Naked. It's about what does it mean as a Pakistani writer to write about something that is explicit. One of the essays here is by Humaira Afridi, which writes about a young girl getting a tattoo in Abu Dhabi, by the way. And what does that mean? You know, having a tattoo on your arm. Another essay here is called My Name, My Faith, which is a UK-based, you know, second-generation Pakistani immigrant who lives in a very, very Pakistani community within the UK. One of the essays is actually by Kamla Shamsi, which is about becoming a British citizen. And what does that mean to your sense of being a Pakistani? Given the sheer variety of themes that we have in this anthology, I would say, again, the thing that connects all these different women writers as perhaps Pakistani writers is that sense of, that sensibility, that way of looking at the world, that minority outlook, that despite being fluent in the English language, despite having the ability to express themselves in English, perhaps having the privilege of a readership, still that sensibility that bonds them across class with all the other Pakistani women, whether they are living in the country or outside. But what do you think, Saba?
So there's a part in the introduction, Sabyn, where you say that, where you're talking about precisely the fact that the voices are distinct, yet they're analogous. And I think you say that there's a truthfulness. You use that word, and it stayed with me. And I think that for me is like a major thread that stitches a lot of these voices, not even the stories, together. And again, we spoke about this, but the format of the creative nonfiction, the personal essay, which I think this anthology really pushes the envelope on, allows for that. And I think it allows Pakistani women writers to kind of own that voice and say, there's some truthfulness that I'm offering, you know, and there were no rules that we were adhering to here. And I think that's really where the magic lies.
Absolutely. And also this idea that there is no such thing as a Pakistani woman. We're all individuals.
Yeah.
You know, we all have our individual identity. So perhaps shattering this myth of representation by providing representation, however paradoxical it sounds.
Yeah. We'll take
one
one
last
final question, and then I think we'll have to wrap.
Yeah, hi. So my name is Dr. Sarah Farid, and I run a social impact venture for arts and culture and education in Karachi. And I'm also a lawyer who runs a 100-year-old law firm, my grandfather's. So with all these experiences, I relate, first of all, to belonging, because I've always been Asian American, and I've always been asked, where are you from in America? And I'm like, I'm from here, I was born here. So my question is, like, how does one find that community of writers to develop your own voice? Because that is something I've struggled with, and even if I have found people, finding that consistency, because everyone is busy or they have some other careers, like maybe they're a doctor or something else that's going on in their lives, so they're not able to have that consistent meetup. I know there are meetups online as well, so that's perhaps a good spot. So what do you recommend for developing your voice? And secondly, for that consistency in writing, that you write on a consistent basis, and creative fiction at that. I know you write non-fiction as well, but that's kind of your forte. But, you know, developing that practice in itself.
I would say reach out to the writers that you like. I would say, you know, the Zenith Harun Prize, enter your work in that. I feel there is a community of writers. We are all, as Pakistani women writers, I feel, we are all very supportive of each other. So get in touch if you would like mentorship. There are projects going on. So have a look. There are prizes, there are initiatives, connect with them. They're also, writing workshops every now and then that I do, at least where I reach out. They're not for profit. It is to find new talent, new voices from Pakistan. As for having a consistent writing practice, you have to show up. You have to put in the work. You have to, if it's important to you, you have to tell yourself, my voice matters, and you have to show up on the page. No one else can give you a magic formula for that. But Saba, I think time's up. But yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sabyn. This was a wonderful conversation, and thank you very much for being a part of it.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for your support, for being here.